Good afternoon, good evening, good morning from wherever you are. Welcome to Fletcher Reads the News and to this really exciting and timely, I hope lively conversation. I voted now with some of our stars in the firmament and the faculty, with Professors Michael Klein, Sung-Yoon Lee, Abigail Linnington, Chris Miller, Nadim Rouhana. I'm going to leave you in the capable hands of Dean Bhaskar Chakravorti in a moment, but I just wanted to welcome you to the Fletcher School, welcome you to this conversation. No matter how often you are refreshing your phone to see whether or not another vote has been counted in Reno or another box has arrived in a town hall somewhere in Maricopa County, this is an interpretation of what this all means to the rest of the world. So the eyes of the world are upon the United States. Their eyes of the world are upon the counting of the votes that have been cast. And in some parts of the world, there's a hope that the United States, I think, is very distracted at the moment. And there's some things going on that perhaps wouldn't happen if we weren't in an elongated test of the fabric of American democracy. So lots going on around the world, lots going on here. How does the rest of the world think about this? How should we view it? What are the foreign policy challenges coming up? With all of that in mind, I hand over to Bhaskar Chakravorti. I look forward to the next 90 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Kyte, and thank you to all of you for joining us. And I'm sure you are obsessively refreshing your screens on Politico.com, NewYorkTimes.com, CNN.com, whatever your media site of choice might be. But while that is happening, we are so glad to have all of you here. This is yet another version of Fletcher Reads the Newspaper, an event that we hold every semester at Fletcher, where we grab the news headlines that are on the front page above the fold and unpack them, get behind them. And the way we do that is by doing things that can perhaps be done only at a place like Fletcher. We go into the stories behind those headlines by taking an intra and an interdisciplinary approach, because these news stories stay on the front pages because they're complicated. And they're complicated because there are multiple issues, themes, disciplines that are packed together in them. And we try and, first of all, get them unpacked with our experts. And our experts are primarily intradisciplinary experts. So Professors Klein, Lee, Linnington, Miller, and Rouhana are each experts in their individual areas. Of course, they're confident in speaking about all kinds of other issues adjacent to those areas, but we will turn to them for their specific areas of expertise in their domains of research and teaching. And then we'll turn the discussion over to our audience, our students, who are our true interdisciplinary experts. They take the classes of our professors, and then they connect the dots and bring this multidimensional perspective on the complicated news stories that we're trying to unpack. So I know that we are all now completely familiar with all the counties in the United States, certainly all the counties in the battleground states, whether it's Maricopa or DeKalb, but we'll, for the next 90 minutes, go a little bit further away from the counties within the United States and travel the world. And we'll travel the world with the help of our faculty. And so what I will do is just give you a sense of what to expect. In the next 25 or so minutes, we'll hear from our faculty experts who each have 5 minutes to give us some insights into what to expect in their domain of foreign policy, starting January 2021, assuming that there is a change of administration, or if there isn't, what would be the contrast between a continuation of Trump versus a new administration under Biden. And then we will turn this over to the audience, and we'll break you out into groups. Each group will have 15 minutes. We'll have about 7 to 8 participants in each group, and you will have a job to do. And your job will be to come up with 2 foreign policy recommendations for a new administration that will be inaugurated in January 2021. So that will be your job. So imagine you are making a presentation to the new Secretary of State, or maybe a continuing Secretary of State, and what would that be? And so after the 15-minute breakout, you will come back to the plenary, and we will randomly pick a few groups to share your recommendations, and we'll have another chance for our faculty experts to comment on what they have just heard, perhaps engage in a discussion on a topic that might strike them as particularly interesting, or challenge it. So that's the idea. We are all involved. We all participate in informing the state of global affairs post-January 2021 in a way that can be done only at Fletcher. So with that, why don't we turn to our experts here? And the way we're going to do this is I will ask some of our faculty to give us a perspective on a particular slice of the world. And others, they will cross those multiple slices in their disciplinary areas. So Professor Lee, we'll ask him to shed some light on the future of foreign affairs as he sees it in the Asia-Pacific region. Professor Miller, give us some insights on the relationship with Russia. Professor Rouhana, a perspective on the Middle East. Then Professors Klein and Linnington take more of a horizontal view across the globe. Professor Klein with international macroeconomics, and Professor Linnington with a perspective on global security and geopolitics. So with that, let me ask Professor Lee, what say you? What's going to be the future of foreign policy as it relates to the Asia-Pacific region? And of course, that includes lots of interesting countries, China and the Korean Peninsula, and of course, several others. So you have 5 minutes, and we'd love to hear your perspective.
Thank you very much. In my given time, I shall attempt to make 5 brief points, 1 point per minute, on the following subjects. First, I shall mention the mundane, then address the arcane, and then intone on the inane, and pontificate a bit on the profane, and close with a bit of commentary on the humane. And if you by then feel that I'm completely insane, I shall certainly nod in approval, agreement. Obama, once he took office in 2009, sent his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, to where on her first foreign trip? To Japan, South Korea, and China. And Obama pivoted, as he said, back to East Asia after years of preponderant US-focused attention in terms of foreign policy on Afghanistan and Iraq under the previous administration. And President Obama himself visited the region, Japan, Singapore, China, and South Korea in November later that year. And he found in China a very formidable foe or adversary or interlocutor. President Hu Jintao was completely in charge of the meeting, did not even agree to a perfunctory press conference with President Obama. President Hu made absolutely no concession whatsoever on Obama's priority on that visit, which was to get China on board in joining the international sanctions regime against Iran on Iran's nuclear program that the United States was building. China did not budge on that issue, or the currency devaluation request by the United States, or on human rights or trade in general. And President Obama returned home a bit disillusioned. I expect President Biden, if Mr. Biden takes office next year, to repivot to East Asia and find in China perhaps even a stronger, even a more formidable counterpart in President Xi Jinping, whom Biden recently called, quote, a thug. Whether it's on tech issues like Huawei, or whether it's on intellectual property theft issues, or currency issues, or trade in general, or the coronavirus, President Biden will have a tough time in swaying too far from what is President Trump's legacy a hardline policy toward China. I don't foresee any real improvement in Sino-US relations in the next couple of years, or perhaps in the next 4 years even. I realize I've already used up maybe half of my given time, so let me quickly move on to the arcane. Few people remember, but once upon a time there was the Florida vote recount in 2000 in the wake of the presidential election between George W. Bush and Al Gore. I mentioned this in a North Korea context. Now, President Trump's epistolary flirtation, love affair with Kim Jong-un, marked by occasional summit pageantry masquerading as nuclear diplomacy, has been an all too predictable abject failure. However, I see no reason, no basis to expect something much better under Trump 2.0, or under the Biden administration for the following reasons. The temptation on the part of the United States president to make history, to lunge at the opportunity to carve out some kind of a North Korea legacy, the moment the North Korean dictator changes his tune from molto agitato to placido and comes out smiling, engaging the world, that temptation is almost irresistible. Few people remember today, but President Bill Clinton really wanted to visit Pyongyang. He really intended to visit North Korea and hold the first ever US-North Korea summit meeting with Kim Jong-il in late 2000. Soon after receiving a North Korean special envoy in the White House, Bill Clinton sent his Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, to Pyongyang to pave the road for his own visit to North Korea, as controversial, arguably even more controversial than meeting the North Korean leader in another country, as Trump has on 2 occasions, was. So the only reason that visit did not happen was because due to the fact that the problem of the vote recount was not resolved until Al Gore conceded defeat in mid-December, and then time simply ran out. So North Korea will raise the stakes early in the Biden administration, as it did in 2009, early in the Obama administration, and in 2017, early in the Trump administration, resort to a major provocation, and at a time of its own choosing, re-engage the United States, and it will be very difficult for President Biden to turn his back on that kind of post-provocation peace ploy overture by North Korea. Moving on to the profane. I don't mean lewd comments or North Korea's rather discourteous diatribe against Mr. Biden last year, calling him a fool of a low IQ, quote, a human being bereft of even the most elementary quality of a human being. And then later on in November 2019, saying that Mr. Biden is, quote, a rabid dog that should be beaten to death with sticks. I don't mean any of that. I mean North Korea's inhumane, deliberate policy of mass starvation, its atrocious human rights record, its ongoing crimes against humanity. Once North Korea changes the tune, acts in a pleasant manner, and is allowing itself to be engaged by the world, any mention of human rights, if there is any forthcoming under the Biden administration, will once again be cast aside. And that is a sad reality. The next president of the United States should call on the North Korean leader to bring down the walls, to dismantle the gulags, the political prisoner concentration camps. No U.S. leader has ever called on the North Koreans to do something basic and elementary and humane as that. And I call on Mr. Biden, President Biden, if he indeed takes office, to address the human rights issue. I think I've already gone way beyond my time limit, so let me come back to my other comments later on.
Time, Professor Lee. We'll take a pause here, and why don't we, so thank you for your insights. You really got us going with a combination of rhyme and prose. And you set the bar high. And let's turn to Professor Miller, and perhaps we can go to the neighborhood just to a little bit to the west of where Professor Lee was, and talk about Russia.
Well, thank you very much, Bhaskar, for the invitation to join here. I'm afraid I lack the poetry to properly follow Professor Lee, but I'll try to give you some insight on where U.S. policy towards Russia might head. I think if you look back over the past 4 years and all of the criticism from the Democratic Party of President Trump on Russia, you might expect vast changes in American policy towards Russia. But my sense, looking at the options that the Biden administration, if indeed it does take office, faces, is that actually there are far fewer major changes on the horizon. And indeed, Russia could well become a relatively low priority for a Biden administration that has plenty of things on its agenda on the domestic front and has a variety of other more pressing foreign policy challenges as well. So in some ways, I think Russia might be surprisingly an area of somewhat continuity with the Trump administration in certain ways. Now, there will be obvious differences in rhetoric. Where President Trump has been relatively friendly towards the Russian government and Russian President Vladimir Putin. If Biden becomes president, he will certainly not echo any of that. The U.S. government will renew its criticisms of Russia over human rights issues. It will more vocally criticize Russia over annexation of Crimea and its invasion of parts of Ukraine. But on other substantive issues, there's just a lot less room for movement. The U.S.-Russian relationship right now is in a state of deep freeze, which is the choice not of individual presidents on either side, but rather structural consensuses in both countries' foreign policy. The two countries disagree on so much that it's just extraordinarily difficult to imagine how any movement might happen in any direction. And as a result, I think there's going to be a strong incentive by the Biden administration to do nothing at all on the Russia front. There's going to be an early step taken to extend an existing arms control treaty called the New START Treaty that will happen in late January or early February. But beyond that, there's not much appetite for working on Russia simply because it seems like there's not much work to be done. And so I think one of the puzzling or surprising consequences of a Biden victory would be that despite all of the criticism of Trump's policy towards Russia over the past couple of years, we're unlikely to see a very different or new policy towards Russia. I think more likely is we don't see much of a policy at all as the United States tries to ignore Russia and deprioritize it as it focuses on other parts of the world. Now, there's no guarantee that Russia will let the Biden administration deprioritize it. There's two players in this game, but it seems like from the perspective of Washington, there are very few fresh ideas on how to approach Russia, very little sense of optimism that anything can be accomplished, and a pretty substantial desire to focus on things that are higher priority to the incoming administration.
Thank you, Professor Miller. So it sounds like the Biden administration's Russia policy is going to be a continuation to some extent of the Trump policies, maybe a change in rhetoric. So perhaps in case there is a transition from Trump to Biden, maybe we can ask the Trump administration to leave their notebooks behind, for whatever conversations have taken place between Trump and Putin, so that Biden can pick up exactly where he left off. In any case, we shall have an opportunity to come back. Let us take a swing around the world to a different region, the Middle East. Professor Rouhana. We need to unmute Professor Rouhana.
Thanking you and thanking my colleagues for this opportunity. I'll limit my time to 5 minutes and a half. And I'll start with describing a cartoon that attracted lots of attention in the Arab world. A young Arab man is leading a march in the streets of unknown city with a big sign saying, "The Arab peoples call on the American Congress to give them the right to vote in the American elections, because after all, people should have the right to determine who rules them." So the view from the Middle East is that the people of the Middle East are ruled by the American administration. This should give us a hint about how much importance peoples in the Middle East place on American elections because of the immediate impact on them and on their daily life. The importance of the US foreign policy to the peoples and leaders, rulers in the Middle East is not new, but the policies of the current administration raised the interests even more. The distinction between peoples and rulers is fundamental here because of the often sharp divergence of their perspective on this, as on many other matters. So while recent public opinion polls, for example, in the Middle East show clearly the Arab views on American foreign policy, about 60% see it in negative light, paralleled only by Iranian foreign policy in the Arab world. Arab rulers actually did take some steps to help the current American administration, President Trump being re-elected, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the Emirates, with the tacit approval of Egypt. So what I want to do is I want to look at three regions in this huge Middle East. I look at the Gulf states and Biden possible policies and change of policies in the Gulf state, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and just a passing note on Egypt. So as to the Gulf situation, states, Iran, Saudi Arabia rivalry, a Biden administration will most likely seek to reinstate the Iran nuclear agreement, but most probably would also seek to negotiate some new terms related to long-term missiles, but mainly to Iran's political intervention in the region, in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, which, as you know, the US helped move to Iran's spheres of influence. The Biden administration will be able to negotiate a deal that will put some limits on Iran's free hand in that part of the Arab world. It perhaps cannot stop Iran from supporting Hezbollah or the Syrian regime, but it can help divert that support to constructive avenues. The challenge of the Biden administration will be that it will need to have the courage to overcome the Iran image that was created and ingrained in public consciousness in order to reach these goals. The Biden administration will probably be harder on Saudi Arabia's Mohammed bin Salman's record and be more openly critical of domestic and perhaps regional policies. The risk there that I see it is that the Biden administration should be aware of the attempt of Mohammed bin Salman to appease the American administration by offering normalization with Israel. What I see as a possible three-way deal is a US, Saudi Arabia, Israel major deal of normalizing the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel in return for Israel to consider the Arab peace plan, not to accept it because this is a revolution, but to say that it will consider it, and this way MBS can have the US overlook his policies. As to the Israeli-Palestinian front, the Biden administration will not have a high bar to cross given what happened in this administration. Here's what I expect and what I think would be of major concern. With the major challenges the administration will face, it cannot dedicate the kind of attention and energy, particularly presidential energy and attention that's needed in these cases, that will allow any serious movement on this front. The Palestinian Authority's place is betting on this, but I think that's not too wise. The administration will make some changes on the margin, such as reinstate financial support to the Palestinian Authority, reopen the office of the PLO in DC, stop the Israeli government from official annexation in the occupied West Bank, and will talk about two-state solution openly. It might even bring about some resumption of negotiation rounds, which proved to be useless in the last 20 years. The concern is that under the rhetorical umbrella of two-state solution and no real policy change, Israel will indeed shelve the official annexation plans, but will continue with its de facto annexation and with its aggressive settler colonial project in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which it enacted under the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations. In 8 years or sooner, we will reach a point of no return. The conflict will be transformed from one on two states, their borders, sovereignty, security, etc., to a conflict about the nature of government in one state, changing it from an explicit apartheid regime to a democratic regime, an internal conflict on equality and human rights. Just 30 seconds on Egypt. As to Egypt, let's remember the Obama speech on democracy, human rights, and democratization in Cairo University in June of 2009. Egypt was the second Arab country to undergo a popular movement for democratization, and Obama, even if hesitantly, sided with the people. Trump reportedly referred to President Sisi as my favorite dictator. Again, the bar is not too high to cross, but what is needed is supporting real democratization and human rights movement in the Arab world, and in Egypt in particular as a cornerstone of dictatorial regimes in the region. That will go a long way to bridge the rupture between the US and the peoples.
Thank you, Professor Rouhana, for the very fast flyby over a complicated region, and you covered an enormous amount of territory and, of course, many long-standing issues. So we look forward to kind of returning to some of these issues as we go deeper into these conversations. Let us now turn to some cross-cutting questions. And for that, let me ask Professor Linnington to help us sort of think about global security, geopolitics. How do you see that playing out as you look across these different slices of the world?
Well, thanks, Bhaskar, and great to be joining everyone on the call today. I see we're up over 100 participants, so that's pretty exciting given what's going on in the world right now, and look forward to all of your views on these issues. So the key foreign policy issue that I would raise, more so from a global security or indeed a national security perspective, when we put ourselves in the shoes of the next US president, is whether the next president views the international security environment, the global security environment, and frames that environment as one of great power competition. Competition between and among the United States or China, and with China and Russia, as his predecessors have done. The Obama administration's national security strategy from 2015 was the first in more than a decade to highlight Russian aggression in Europe because of their annexation of Crimea and election interference. And it also marked a shift in US policy by acknowledging the security tensions in East Asia due to China's military modernization and maritime claims in the South and East China Sea. Then when President Clinton came in late 2017, releasing its national security strategy, it doubled down on this idea and this framing of, from a US perspective, of great power competition as well. And it argued, quote, that China and Russia challenge American power and influence and interests and attempt to erode American security and prosperity. At the same time, the document affirmed that, quote, allies and partners, while magnifying US power, we expect them to bear a fair burden of responsibility to protect against common threats. So these two themes that were a major part of President Trump's interaction with the world, we want to reassess through the perspective of a Biden administration. Clearly, in the last 4 years, the inconsistencies of the Trump administration policies towards Russia, hard bargaining with NATO allies, throwing historical, traditional military alliances with South Korea, NATO, Germany and Japan about investments in defense and military infrastructure have strained relations and allowed other states, not least of which Russia and China, to exploit those divisions between US allies and partners. In a Biden administration, I would expect that the former vice president would affirm a similar framing and prioritization of those security challenges based upon his views during the Obama administration. And if he does, I'll be looking for indications of the how the administration chooses to address these threats. What do they see as the significant capabilities and threats to US interests? How do they frame them in the public space? And what are the primary ways and the resourcing that he will use to do this? Will there be increased funding for our Department of State, for the international development funds, or will he continue to keep defense spending at the same levels or decreased? What are the ways that he sees competing, if indeed he sees it as a competition, with a long-term threat from China? How does he see the US competing politically, economically, and militarily? One of the first departures I hope to see in a prospective Biden White House will be to place a much higher priority on reassuring allies in Europe and East Asia of US commitments to their security, and how much time he will devote to foreign policy issues in comparison to a pretty robust domestic agenda. When we look back on Vice President Biden's role in the Obama administration, he tended to reflect President Obama's restraint regarding engagements overseas, a desire to seek limited foreign policy goals, and a very healthy skepticism regarding allies' commitments to burden sharing, as well as to military interventions overseas. I think it's also important to note that he was pushing back on a more activist Secretary of State at the time, Hillary Clinton, or Secretary Gates in terms of increased defense spending. And so I'll be looking for those indications of where he chooses to put the resources across the US government as an indication of where his national security perspective will play out in the foreign policy arena. Thanks, Bhaskar.
Thank you, Professor Linnington. You've given us a lot to consider, particularly the question of whether a Biden administration, where it picks up the threads from where Obama might have left off. And you mentioned three dimensions, politics, military, and economics as being, three areas of consideration. We have been talking about politics. We've spoken about security and the military. Let's turn to economics. And let me ask Professor Klein. We are now at a point when the IMF is projecting the global economy is going to shrink to only by 4% as opposed to more than 5% that was projecting before. The chief economist of the IMF has talked about potential liquidity trap, that countries around the world are likely to go into. So lots of questions about how countries around the world are going to deal with the pandemic and the economic effects of the pandemic. What might we expect from a Biden administration and in contrast to a Trump administration starting January 2021 as far as international macroeconomic policy is concerned?
Well, thank you for inviting me to participate in this. I'm going to start out by quoting one of my favorite philosophers, Yogi Berra, the baseball player, who said that forecasting is difficult, especially about the future. So it's going to be hard to, we don't even know what the outcome of the election is yet. Although it does look like we'll have President Biden, but it also looks like we might have a Republican Senate. And that will be important, the split government. For example, in 2008, when President Obama first entered government, at that time, which was the worst downturn since the Great Depression, Mitch McConnell said, our goal is to make President Obama a one-term president, not to save the country, not to rescue the economy, but this very political move. It looks like Mitch McConnell may again be the head of the Senate, and one shudders a bit to think that that could be his goal. In economics, I try to teach my class that in economics, a good answer to many questions is it depends. And in this case, it really depends upon what happens with the COVID-19 pandemic. Worldwide, we're seeing continued shutdowns and even new shutdowns in places like England and Greece. The United States, we're having shutdowns. In Massachusetts, we're now wearing masks everywhere. And the recovery of the economy in the United States and elsewhere really depends upon getting the COVID-19 pandemic under control to some extent. And it's not quite clear what that means, under control, but it's not going to be a quick process. It won't disappear like magic once the warm weather comes. In fact, it didn't. And it's only supposed to get worse when the cold weather appears, as it is now starting to do. The world is now, Gita Gopinath, as you said that, well, maybe it's going to be a 4% decline instead of a 5% decline. That's still pretty bad. That's like saying, well, maybe I only broke one of my bones instead of two of them. So that's still a bad outcome, and it's not something, that is at all optimistic. The decline has been the deepest since the 1930s. It's actually been more precipitous since the 1930s as well. We had a decline over the course of 6 months that took several years from 1929 to 1933. So what do we do? Well, this is an international problem, and there has to be a coordinated response to it, something that's been sadly missing up until this time. And in fact, in the United States, there wasn't even a domestic response that followed the science. So it's going to be very important that the economy recovers through an effort to follow science to get the COVID problem under control. And in the meantime, it's going to be really important that people are afforded a lifeline, something like what the CARES Act did, which expired at the end of July. And a lot of people now are going to be in a very, very hard situation. And also the economy is going to be worse off. We've seen continuing weakness in the economy, and it's only been getting worse as we've moved deeper into the fall. Another international aspect, something that was here before COVID, is the question of trade. The demonization of China in terms of trade. There are issues with China. There are issues of intellectual property. There are other issues that are raised but aren't really issues, like issues of the bilateral trade deficit with China. In some ways, a bilateral trade deficit is completely mismeasured because goods that are imported from China, there's no sense of whether or not those goods include intermediate inputs that came from other countries. Like the iPhone, it's estimated that a $225 import of an iPhone really was only a $5 value-added import from China. So the Trump administration tried to go it alone with these things, but many of these issues would have been better handled through a multilateral stance. For example, through the Trans-Pacific Partnership, something that the Trump administration stepped out of in its first days in office. And finally, I would just mention that across the world, questions of inequality, the consequences of globalization, whether properly attributed to globalization or not, the decline of traditional industries like manufacturing in many advanced countries, these are problems that will have to be addressed because they affect people's lives, they affect the politics, and it's something where a sort of easy, quick solution, as we've seen over the last 4 years, is not actually possible. And so it has to take more thought, more consideration, and dare I say, more listening to experts.
Well, that's a good note to take a pause on in terms of listening to experts, because this is a point when we are going to pivot to a different class of experts, which are our interdisciplinary experts, our students and other members of the audience. But before we go there, I would like to stick with our current panel of experts to see if you have any additional comments just based on what you heard from your colleagues. Is there something that struck you as something that we should hear a little bit more about? Is there something you'd like to challenge based on what you just heard or build on? Anybody?
Well, it seems to me, Bhaskar, if I could jump in, that listening to the really dire economic forecast that we just heard and the resurgence of COVID in the past couple of weeks, that in some ways the interesting story is going to be, at least over the next couple of months, how foreign policy will be on the back burner for a potential Biden administration, just given all of the domestic issues at home. And perhaps that's the correct interpretation of the election results. I'm not sure, but it does seem like if you listen to what Biden has been talking about through the campaign, it hasn't been foreign policy focused at all. And so I do wonder whether that's actually the really interesting and overriding conclusion, is that he's not planning to be a foreign policy president, or at least not in 2021.
Yeah, definitely seems that way. Professor Miller, do others agree that foreign policy is going to take a backseat, at least in the immediate few months, either under a Biden administration or a Trump 2.0? Go ahead, Professor.
I certainly agree with Chris, and actually in my remarks took that into consideration in terms of no major change, no serious movements on major issues. But what might happen is that developments in the world might force the American administration to take that into account and bring back foreign policy to the core. But in general, I agree with that.
Yeah, well, one of the points that Professor Klein made about controlling COVID struck me as a foreign policy, if not a multilateral policy issue, which is he talked about the need for a coordinated response. And when you think about coordination, we often turn to multilateral bodies like the World Health Organization that the US in this current administration has turned its back on. And I'm wondering whether there is an avenue for foreign policy to come back even in the domain of responding to COVID, because COVID is not going to respect borders, even with international travel being down. We do need coordination, not just in addressing the disease, but also managing the vaccine that was promised before Election Day and clearly is not here yet. But hopefully in 2021, we will see a vaccine, in fact, several. And then the logistics of producing a vaccine, distributing a vaccine, and then enabling travel post-vaccine is going to require coordination. And I'm curious about whether that any of you think that's an important vector for foreign policy.
May I ask a question to Michael, to Professor Klein?
Please.
Sure.
Joe Biden has spoken of, Buy American Goods plan, Buy American Goods, and the appropriation of $300 billion to build up high-tech technologies in the United States, including 5G, even electric cars, artificial intelligence. And he's spoken of China's some 30-fold increase in budget in R&D, research and development, over the past 25 years or so, the 1990s and 2000s and up to 2016, I think. So do you think this is feasible? That is, furthermore, recently, a couple of weeks ago, CSIS, as we know, a think tank, Center for International Strategic Studies in DC, did a survey on so-called thought leaders, and 72% of the respondents said that the United States should completely ban Huawei and TikTok and Chinese technology from the US market. Do you think that's the right approach?
I don't think that's the right approach. And, you know, one thing that I didn't mention that sort of gets to your point is that the United States now has a debt to GDP ratio that it's not seen since the end of World War II. It's now over 100%. The end of World War II is 106%. Similarly, other countries are facing large debts and they have very big deficits. And so there's going to be an issue about how are these resolved. Now, it's not the right time yet to start to resolve these, but at some point, you know, when we're past all of this, that will be an issue. So then the question is how much fiscal space would be left for these other kinds of initiatives. For example, the Green New Deal, if we had something like the Green New Deal, one could imagine that that would include a big research and development component. In a way, you know, you can think about in the 1960s, the efforts to get a man on the moon led to a lot of developments that spilled over into other areas of the economy. Perhaps the Green New Deal would have a similar thing. The first thing that comes to my mind is better batteries, which would have a tremendous effect as we move to electric cars, but lots of other things as well. So, you know, on the one hand, I think there's not going to be a lot of fiscal space for undertaking these kinds of initiatives. On the other hand, I think that some of the crises that we're facing, you know, the existential crisis of climate change could lead to a situation with a new administration that actually faces this and tries to do something about it. And there could be these positive spillover effects for research and development. It turns out that a lot of research and development is in fact sponsored by governments across the world, sometimes for military reasons that have other kinds of spillovers, sometimes for other reasons. And to the extent that there's an industrial policy, if it's often tied up with other kinds of policies as well. And to the extent that military policy is foreign policy or an aspect of foreign policy, it can be tied up with that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I did talk for a long time and maybe I said something or maybe not.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Klein. You certainly sort of triggered the notion of what a Biden administration might do in response to the climate crisis. And the Green New Deal is a domestically oriented issue, but as we know, there's a foreign policy cousin of that called the Paris deal, which isn't so new and will not be green if the United States is not a part of it. And I'm curious about what Dean Kyte thinks about the Biden administration and its stance towards the Paris deal, which the United States, I think, just walked away from yesterday.
Well, thank you. Well, it formally, the notification on June 1st, 2017, that the Trump administration would withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement came into effect on November the 4th. So it was a sad day, and actually the official communique that was pushed out by the past president of the negotiating process and the current president and the incoming president, so Chile, Italy and the UK, noted with regret on behalf of the parties to the Paris Agreement the exit of the United States. So another time a discussion about exactly all of what that means and its consequences. But I think that what was very clear is that Biden took to Twitter yesterday, something that he doesn't do that often, and said, you know, in 77 days we will re-enter the Paris Agreement. So the expectation is that if Biden assumes the presidency, that there would be an immediate signal then that the US will re-enter, and that is allowed for and would be ushered in smoothly by the UN and the Paris process. One expects that the other announcement that would be made at that time would be to rejoin the World Health Organization. So I agree that I think for a Biden administration, this is a really a steep hill to climb, with a country divided and with an economic situation laid out by Professor Klein. So this is a domestic presidency, but the climate politics mean that within a very short period of time, and certainly before November, early November of 2021, the US administration can't just say that it's rejoining Paris. It will actually have to say what it's bringing to the party, which means that it will have to make decisions about net zero commitments, but more importantly, it will have to say what it expects to achieve by 2030, and it will have to explain how it's going to ratchet up its ambition. And I think the rest of the world has moved on in the last 4 years. And while people express their regret that the US has left and want and need the US back, there is also a sense that the US, that the rest of the world is getting on with it. And there is now a race to net zero emissions with the EU, China, Japan, the Republic of Korea, all having declared that they've joined that race just in the last 6 weeks alone. So climate change is not going to allow the domestic agenda to be the only focus of the Biden administration. And I would expect that the Biden team would find ways to be very muscular in the way in which they engage climate. Climate will also change some of the geopolitics. This will be a decade where there has to be action on the Arctic. The United States will have to rejoin that debate in a slightly more fulsome way than I think has been the case under the Trump administration.
Great, thank you, Dean Kyte. And as you can see from the tone of these discussions, there are so many different facets to the notion of global affairs, regardless of which administration comes into place, either through the traditional avenues of politics or the military, national and international security or economics, or through the vectors of carbon and climate. Or through yet another vector that we haven't spoken about that has to do with technology. The Biden administration, or if there's a return to the Trump administration, will have to pick up a whole slate of issues relating to reining in the power of the big technology companies resident here in the United States that have impact all over the world. But this is in a context of the United States and China in particular, we are creating a great power competition in the arena of technology. So just by taking on big tech here in the United States and the games that we've been playing with companies like TikTok, you are stepping into foreign policy, by proxy. Well, of course, we could keep going for a long time, but we want the real problem solvers to get at it. So here's how this is going to work. Our tech guru, Brad, is going to send us all off into breakout groups. And 15 minutes, each breakout group, if you could select a student who will be your facilitator and your leader. And that person is going to then do a read back to the plenary when we bring you all back. I'd also encourage you to pick a second person who will be the scribe. So you have a facilitator and a scribe in each group who can capture the ideas. So your task is 2 foreign policy priorities for the new administration. And in 15 minutes, we come back and we'll hear from at least some of the groups. And I hope that we'll be able to capture all of your ideas in some form. So the scribes, if you could keep your notes, and we'll give you a place to scan your notes or look at your digital notes, and we'll try and create some kind of a compendium because I'm sure there'll be some great insights through the rapid fire conversations that you guys are going to have. So 15 minutes, Brad, if you could help us disperse. Okay. So here we have it, foreign policy at warp speed. And why don't we go to Bryant, Jack, Jean-Marc, and Professor Rouhana. What say you? What are the top 2 priorities for the new administration in January 2021?
I must say that I was there I didn't participate as we, as we agreed upon. So the students and the participants did the work. I just listened. So we have somebody who's going to report. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so for our group, we mentioned two main things. The first thing is what a former Fletcher professor extraordinaire Martel calls sources of disorder in his book, Strategy in Theory and Practice. And basically, the sources of disorder, currently they manifest themselves in various forms. One is definitely the intense political divide. And one could go further and say that the number one national security threat now is the intense divisiveness. So that's one source of disorder. A second source of disorder is populist nationalists, either on the left or on the right, and we're seeing armed groups or militias, and some we call them domestic terror groups. A third source of disorder is what seems likely to be a Republican majority in the Senate, right? So for us, we think it's important for the sources of disorder to be addressed, right? And one could push back and say these sources of disorder are domestic issues, but we believe that any mature foreign policy thinker will not decouple these domestic issues with foreign policy making. So that's the first one that needs to be addressed. The second issue that we touched on has to do with COVID-19 and an international coordination to curb and find a vaccine. We also mentioned the importance of China and the U.S. Building better relations with China to ensure that this is a joint effort.
Just give us two, John Mark. So
Yes. Yeah. So the two are the sources of disorder, and first source of disorder, second COVID-19.
Okay. Let me go to our intradisciplinary experts. Any reactions to what you just heard? Would you agree? Would you challenge this? Something that you might want to build on further?
So Bhaskar,
Anybody?
I guess I would say that, we had a similar conversation in our national security decision-making class earlier today about how these domestic priorities, domestic security priorities, were likely to weigh more heavily on a president, particularly coming straight out of an election process. There's a great book by Jim Steinberg and Kurt Campbell, who are two names that, might have some influence in the future administration if President Biden is elected, who talk about the difficulty moving to a foreign policy prioritization after the focus of a domestic election that requires so much interaction on these particular issues of divisiveness in the polity, inequality in America, and not to mention the health and the economic concerns that I think we've already covered well from Michael's previous comments.
So this is a timely reminder that we create these distinctions between domestic policy or domestic issues and foreign policy, but these are all tightly intertwined, and one can't do one in a separate, in a compartmentalized way relative to the other. So these issues have to be looked at as a system. And even though elections are fought on domestic issues, those domestic issues then translate into how one looks at global affairs. So it's all interconnected. All right, so let's just take the perspective of a different group. Emmanuel, Jake, Mike, Novlet.
Thank you, Bhaskar, and then thank you for all the panelists. So far, the discussion has been great. Our group took a post-COVID-19 sort of approach to what the POTUS should be focusing on. We heard in the panel discussion that the immediate next 2 to 5 months will be focused on COVID-19, but what should the President of the United States do simultaneously or afterwards? And our two recommendations were, number one, manage capitalism and make it a political issue. And we've seen that the tax regulations around these multinational corporations that operate in different countries. They're growing inequality, and policy is not catching up. And we believe that if President Biden is the next president, then they should focus on his agenda about, increasing the tax on the top 1%. But also we recommended this is sophisticate the tax regulations around the large multinational corporations. And our second recommendation was to address global migration. Domestically, these include, the approaches towards deportation and the restrictions around the visas, both on work and academic visas. But internationally, I think the United States, if again Biden is the assumed president, should use his rhetorical stance to combat xenophobia, and then put a welcoming rhetoric around refugees and forced migrants. That's our two recommendations.
Great, thank you, Emmanuel. Professor Klein, any comments on managed capitalism as a priority?
So when people talk about that, I don't know what it means. People say, oh, Biden's a socialist. What is managed capitalism? I mean, we have no examples of pure capitalism. What is managed capitalism and what would it look like? It's already managed along a number of dimensions now. So I'm not quite sure what managed capitalism means. Emmanuel, maybe you could fill me in a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I could say a little bit about what the thought process behind it. Like the founder of capitalism, if we look back and say like sort of is Adam Smith, and then if we sort of—
He was somebody who wrote about it. He didn't find it.
Right. So sort of articulated the whole concept behind it. Let's say that if he was here today, I think
He'd be very old.
He'd be very old, yeah. And he was time warped, and he landed in today's world. I think it would be difficult for him to sort of argue for a free market capitalism that he was arguing for during his time, due to the sort of like internationalization of what the world has become, right? And because of this, for example, the number one thing I see is like tax havens that are going into like Bermuda and Ireland, etc., that are allowing like inequality to grow increasingly in the present.
I don't see that as a, I mean, I have trouble sometimes with like these really big concepts because, with all due respect, Emmanuel, you're a really smart guy. It's sort of like after you get past the buzzword, what does it mean? So if you want to be very specific about things, is the tax code progressive in the United States? Well, that's actually, there's a question beyond that. Is not just the tax code, but spending progressive as well? So, when people are talking about overthrow capitalism, we don't have capitalism. We have this system that is mixed, as do every other country. And so what specifically are you talking about? So I think, one of the things that I try to do in my courses is to get people to think precisely and rigorously about these things. And, there's, you're spending a lot of money for this stuff. So you should, take what you're being taught and, try to think carefully and precisely about this. So I don't mean to be disrespectful to you, Emmanuel, and I have a tremendous respect for you. But, one of the things that we want to do is teach people to think carefully and within the realm of, what are we actually talking about? So, sorry, it's kind of cold water, but
I mean, the only question I would have for that, Professor Klein, is that how do you recommend we approach the problem of the increasing inequality in today's world?
So I think there are a lot of things. I think, one thing is that it's a range of things, and inequality can mean very different things. Are you talking about inequality within a country, or inequality where, some countries are very, very poor and other countries are much richer? And they're different, the latter. So between countries, what do we do? So, we've had the greatest progress in human material development that has ever been seen over the last 40 years. 1.1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. And a lot of that has to do with, China and India opening up and becoming more engaged in the world economy. And places that are more stagnant are places that are more government controlled. So if you're talking about the latter, we actually have a friend of mine, Lant Pritchett, who's a well-known development economist, was so outraged when the Nobel Prize was awarded to people who are doing these studies, because he said, this is okay and it's interesting, but the real way that people move out of poverty is not whether or not they have mosquito nets, but you have to have economic growth, and that's a real challenge. But we have in fact seen this huge development from the very, the most wretched poor in the world have advanced. And there's also been greater inequality within China, for example, or within India as a consequence. So it's not a simple thing because, everybody's been lifted. Some people have been lifted a lot more than others. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is within a country, what do we do? So there are a lot of sort of things within a country where the transfers are much easier because you have a central government than across countries where you don't. So, I would hope in the courses I teach, people sort of learn to frame questions in a way that actually are, unfortunately more narrow because they're less heroic that way, but I think it's kind of more practical as well. So that's my rant for the evening.
So Bhaskar, can I jump in?
Please.
So I would never normally say this, Emmanuel, but if you can't sleep and if you've got any spare time, you should read the World Economic Outlook published by the IMF just a few weeks ago, because it's the closest thing to a page turner that you can get on this subject. Before COVID hit, Olivier Blanchard, the architect of a decade or more of austerity or more, started to walk back and sort of say we may have to turn the corner because a lack of inclusion in economies and between economies is becoming a real problem, not between economies, within economies. It's corrosive for growth. And now what you've seen as COVID hits is really a think about what, if we've got to dig our way out of this extensive economic downturn that Professor Klein described, is how are we going to do that? Do we spend our way out of that? How do we spend our way out of it? And you saw everybody referring to Gita Gopinal's piece in the FT this week, talk about the liquidity gap. So you stitch these things together, and the Biden administration, if it is a Biden administration, is going to face an extraordinary domestic problem and an extraordinary demand on an international response, the like of which we've never seen before, with a rather rickety structure called a G20, a G7, which hasn't lived up to expectations, some pretty important calls for more fundamental discussions, and with a China now that is not the junior partner at the G20, but would sit there in a much more muscular fashion. And so the Biden administration Treasury team, Biden administration National Security Council team on the economic side, jobs that Professor Klein used to do, have got some really important thinking through about is there a sort of international light version of some of the things that are being discussed in the Green New Deal that has to come into international economic management? And we could talk at much greater length about some of the ideas that are on the table around debt beyond what has been possible under the Trump administration, but that's for another time.
Great, thank you. Thank you for great observations, Dean Kyte and Professor Klein. And Emmanuel, you've got your weekend assignment all cut out for you. Just as a quick plug, Gita Gopinath, Chief Economist, the IMF, and I, we're going to have a conversation about precisely this topic this weekend on Saturday at 11:30. If anybody's interested, write to me. I'll send you the link. Okay, let's go to another group, and that unfortunately will be the last of our warp speed foreign policy recommendations because we are running out of time. So let's go to Danielle, Fred, Rolu, and Ross.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, hi. So our group, we really only came up with one foreign policy priority, but it had to do with Turkey. We would like to establish a democratic engagement with them on human rights. They've been imprisoning both lawyers and judges at a rapid rate there. And because of that, a lot of Turkish institutions are crumbling, and these are only being exacerbated by the Beirut explosion in April and the earthquake that occurred last week. We'd also like to renew an alliance with the Kurds, and we'd like to do this with a multilateral approach towards Europe, with us taking a more active, the United States taking a more active role in the hopes of encouraging European nations to follow suit.
Okay, thank you for that, Ross. Any reason why you picked Turkey as your #1 priority? I know that there are important issues there, but curious as to why Turkey over all others.
Well, I think it had to do with the fact that we wanted to bring it, make people more aware of it, what's going on there. They've had a lot of.
Okay, fair enough.
issues.
Professor Rouhana, any comments?
Not much really. You know, the current administration does have, I mean, it takes a change of policy in the Middle East altogether. What's happening, the Turkish interests in Syria, the Turkish intervention in Libya, what's happening now in Azerbaijan and Armenia, these are all major policy issues that American foreign policy at some point would have to deal with. And we expect that the Biden administration would have a different take on that. Sometimes people do not exactly understand why the Trump administration did have this approach to Erdogan and to Turkey. But I honestly don't know more than that.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you. Thank you to all of you for your engagement and your commitment. And as I mentioned, this is the kind of conversation that can happen only at Fletcher. This is just a taste of what to expect, whether it's the digital Fletcher or the brick and mortar Fletcher that we hope we shall all be a part of starting January 2021, in addition to the new administration, January 2021. So with that, let me bring this conversation to a close. I put the email for Agnes Hatley, who will receive your Warp Speed policy recommendations, if you would care to share them. We will share it on our website along with a write-up of this event. And for a final word to take us away, back to Dean Kyte.
So while we've been discussing, I'm sure 2 more votes have been counted, and while the agonizingly slow process of counting every vote goes forward, the world is coming at whoever will be president at warp speed. So we're going to organize more of these in the weeks and months to come, chance to really be able to pick through how the world might shift on its axis, or how the US within that world might shift on it. So keep thinking about this. This isn't the last time we'll have a chance to have this conversation. I'm grateful to the members of the faculty, grateful always to Bhaskar for his leadership. Thanks to everybody behind the scenes that's making the Zoom work. And let's continue this conversation. It is what makes Fletcher such a special place. Thank you very much. Stay safe. Keep refreshing your screens. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you to all of you, and be safe. And I'd like to give a special shout out to several of our colleagues who helped make this happen: Dorothy Orzelak, Agnes Hatley, and last and absolutely not least, Brad McComber. Thank you. Bye-bye.